Hey, Nathan.
Yeah.
We are on the fourth leg of our intimacy table.
Oh, boy.
And it's your favorite one.
The one where we talk about your personality?
Oh, no. It's about sexual intimacy.
Oh, let's talk. This episode 3 hours?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, let's get into that. Before we get into today's episode, just wanted to remind you that in the description of the video below, we put links to all of our social media accounts.
You can always reach us with questions or comments about this episode at marriagebydesignpodcast@gmail.com.
And finally, if you want to support us financially, there is a link to be able to do so at the end of each of the descriptions of our videos. Now, let's get back to the show. Hey, everybody, I'm Nate Warnock.
I'm Andrea Warnock, and you've joined us for Marriage Monday on the Marriage by Design podcast. And this is a time that we get to talk to you about God's design for marriage, what the Bible has to say about that, and how we live that out practically.
That's right. So we've been covering the last, now 4 weeks about what we're calling the intimacy table. And it's this idea that our marriages are like a table with 4 legs, one on each corner. And the 4 sort of legs of intimacy on this table are emotional intimacy, non-sexual physical intimacy, spiritual intimacy, and then sexual intimacy. And so we've spent a week talking about each one of those over the last month, and we're, as you mentioned, wrapping that up today.
Nathan saved the best for last, right?
That's exactly right. Talking about sexual intimacy. Now, before we dig into this, I want to just say a couple of things up front. We're not talking about necessarily what sex is. We're not talking about
how to get better at that in your relationship.
What's are we allowed to do when we have sex? What are we not like that? This isn't that. We have spoken on that on this podcast in the past, so I'd encourage you to check those out, and I'll link a few of those throughout this video. So if you see the little, if you're watching on YouTube and you see the little bubble pop up in the top right-hand corner, you can click on that and check out some of our other episodes on sex. But so we've talked about this quite a bit because it's such a huge part of marriage.
And something we consistently get questions about.
That's right. So in this case, what we're wanting to talk about is actual intimacy. And you may be listening to this and going, well, I don't even know. I mean, sex is intimate. And that's exactly right. It is intimate. But I have found that this sexual intimacy topic is the one where in marriage we can most fool ourselves. Meaning, a lot of people, if you struggle in emotional intimacy in your marriage, you know. If you struggle in physical intimacy in your marriage, maybe you do have physical intimacy, you hold hands or whatever, but if you struggle in that area, you know. I have found so many couples don't realize the difference between having sex and having sexual intimacy, because those two things are not mutually exclusive. Now, let me be clear. This is how I would say it.
This is not the way it was meant to be.
That's right. But here's what I would say. In order to have sexual intimacy, you must be having sex.
Sure.
But the fact that you are having sex does not mean you have emotional intimacy. Then I give you a perfect example. Sex outside of marriage precludes true sexual intimacy. Why? Because it's ultimately a performance-based relationship. Because if I'm not good enough at it for you, if I don't do the right things, if I'm too pushy with sex, if I am too withholding of sex, then that may be the straw that breaks the camel's back and you'll leave the relationship. That precludes intimacy, period.
But in a biblical marriage, there is no leaving the relationship.
That's right.
So it can't be performance-based.
Exactly right. So, and you might say, well, doesn't emotional intimacy and spiritual intimacy and physical, non-sexual physical intimacy, can't those be undermined before marriage too? And I would say, yes.
Sure.
That's why I always tell people the person you're thinking of marrying, if you're dating or engaged and you want a piece of free advice real quick, the person you're dating or engaged to will never act better behaved than they are right now because of exactly what we just said. And that very statement I just made precludes true intimacy in those areas, because what I just said is they'll never act better than they are right now in these areas because they want to close the deal, right? If they're trying to marry you or continue the relationship, right, or get you to move in with them or get you to have sex with them or whatever the next rung they have on their relationship ladder is. So within marriage, that's where we find true intimacy. And isn't that just such a picture of the gospel message? Because apart from Christ, we cannot have true intimacy either with ourselves or with God. Mm-hmm. God, because he cannot stand to be with a sinful human being, yoked to a sinful human being. That was the gospel message. That's what Christ did on the cross, is bridge that divide so that we could have intimacy, right, with the Father. And with ourselves, because we can only truly know ourselves by knowing and having intimate relationship with our Creator. Mm-hmm. So just as we can't have true intimacy apart from relationship in Christ, we can't have true intimacy with our significant other apart from marriage. So that's what we're going to talk about today, sexual intimacy. And really, this boils down to just a couple of points that we're going to spend the next probably 20 minutes or so chatting through. And those 2 points are communication and intentionality. And as we slide into those, I also want to make a point to say, Andrea and I have spent a decent amount of time talking about, how do we think about sex within marriage? Because there's some pretty pointed verses in the Bible, particularly by Paul, that can cause some tricky conversations with regards to sex. And we get, and so we did an episode last season about Paul's verse in 1 Corinthians, I believe it's 7, mm-hmm, talking about do not deprive your spouse of sex. And then he goes on to say, because your wife's body belongs to the husband's body belongs to the wife. And man, if that doesn't trigger people, that verse, and boy, do we do a whole bunch of fancy footwork and see people do a whole bunch of fancy footwork to try and avoid the plain meaning of that verse. Mm-hmm. So if you have had that verse lobbed offensively at you in the past, or have lobbed that verse offensively, or just read it and went, man, that kind of makes me feel uncomfortable, or man, I really wish I understood what Paul was saying, we're going to talk about that verse again next week on this podcast, because I think we have misconstrued that verse a little bit, and I want to use the plain meaning of the verse to talk a little bit about how we ought to be thinking about the fact that Paul says, from a spiritual standpoint and a physical standpoint, Andrea's body is mine and my body is hers. Mm-hmm. So what does that look like? So we're gonna table that conversation, because I that would take the entire rest of our time today, I'm sure. That's why we're gonna do a whole episode about it, and really our second episode about it next week. So I would invite you to check that out. Yep. So as we think about sexual intimacy, I want to encourage you, as you think about this, to think about, if you're in marriage, do you have a sexual relationship? Not intimacy. Do you have a sexual relationship? If you do not have a sexual relationship, and I know because I read articles about marriage all the time, that there are an increasing number of marriages that they have reached this.
There's a term for them.
Sexless marriages.
Yeah, but and that's, funny thing is, they consider couples who have sex like less than, I don't remember, 4 times a year to be sexless marriages.
I gotta be honest, I would feel that way as well.
Right.
I mean, that yikes. But that, I mean, that's an increasing trend of folks that are sort of getting married for reasons other than sex,
or their relationship
has deteriorated,
just devolved into that.
Sure. Yeah, and if you're watching this and you go, man, that's kind of where we're at, and I'm okay with that, I would just encourage you to say, if you're watching this video and you consider yourself a follower of Christ and his gospel message in the Bible, you cannot have a sexless marriage and have a God-honoring marriage. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but there's a but to that. There are marriages that physically that's not possible. You know, that excludes those things where it's like, hey, this is not a physical possibility. There's some things going on that just that's not possible.
Sure, and yes, I guess that's a good catch. I'm obviously not talking about marriages that are sexless marriages because we live in a fallen world and someone has something that prohibits them from physically being able to have sex. I'm talking about people that have chosen to not have sex for whatever reason they've come up with that they want to choose to not do that. The Bible, I believe, specifically commands against that. And you can go look at 1 Corinthians 7 for Paul's discussion of that because he's pretty clear on that. Okay. Sexless marriages aside, when we think about sex, having a sexual relationship versus having sexual intimacy, babe, how would you recommend people sort of gauge their, like, how do we grade our, so to speak, grade our marriage on our level of sexual intimacy? What kind of things would you be telling a woman or who's talking to you or a couple that's talking to us, hey, here's the things you ought to be looking at to see if you have sexual intimacy in your marriage?
Yeah, I think two of the biggest ones are do we have sexual intimacy can be gauged by, am I constantly looking for reasons to not have sex with my partner or hoping that I can get out of it.
Yep.
Or something like that. Because if that's one or both of your mindset, you probably don't have sexual intimacy.
Yep.
And the other side of that is if sex or what you think is sexual intimacy is you're thinking about you and it's a self-serving thing.
Yep.
For you, then you probably don't have sexual intimacy in your marriage.
That's good. And I would add to that, if you are using cheap alternatives as a substitute for sex, you are undermining sexual intimacy as well. I can say, for example, and we've said this publicly on this channel, I'm not a believer that masturbation in and of itself is a sin, but I believe it can be a sin if you're using it to take care of that need in a manner that does not include your spouse, or that you're specifically using it so that you don't have to rely on your spouse for sexual intimacy.
Yep.
I can give you another example straight offhand. If you are looking at pornography as an alternative to sex within your marriage, you're more than undermining, you're completely destroying the sexual intimacy in your marriage. So those are kind of the two main ones that I say when I'm talking about cheap alternatives to pursuing sex in your marriage.
Yep.
Okay, so as you're thinking about that,
are there things that you think undermine or are gauges of a lack of sexual intimacy?
Yeah, I think again this is probably a duh thing, but if you don't have regular sex,
sure,
you probably don't have sexual intimacy. And again, I'm not talking about for a short period of time. I'm talking about just a pattern of not having sex within marriage. And I'm sure someone's going to leave a comment below that says, well, how often is the right amount? And, I think we have to remember that the Holy Spirit, when we commit our lives to Christ, the Bible's clear that the Lord gives us the Holy Spirit, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit within us to give us discernment, to give us wisdom, to minister to us. And so in some ways, the question of how much sex is the right amount of sex is sort of like me saying, well, how much drinking is the right amount of drinking? Like, if I asked 50 Christians that, I'd get 50 different answers,
Sure.
and every one of those answers could be right if they are being weighed by the conviction of the Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly the same thing applies here. You may very well be in a marriage where you as a couple are like, if we had sex, every once a week or something like that, that would be fine for me. And we would still feel intimate. Now, if you're going, hey, we've decided, once a quarter is right for us, then, it could be that there's just a lack of sexual intimacy that you're leaning into in that. But, as long as you're having regular sex, I would say that's an indicator that you're open to sexual intimacy. Now, sex can, in the modern age in America, can be performative too, can it? Mm-hmm. So it can be like we have sex, but we're just having sex because we know how to have sex, and we're not actually opening ourselves up to intimacy within that. And that's the one I want to address here with this episode.
I think that's really a bigger hurdle than we're not having sex.
100%. I completely agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the two things I want you to take away from this video, and I want you to talk about them with your spouse. Communication and intentionality. Is your sexual relationship defined by communication and intentionality? I'm going to talk about communication. Andrew's going to talk about intentionality. But I want you to ask yourself and your spouse, is your sexual relationship defined by these things? If it is, you probably have sexual intimacy. And if you continue to practice these, you will continue to grow in deeper sexual intimacy. So communication. Well, here's what I got. Communication. There's 3 of them.
Wow, that was great.
See what I did there? The first one is communicating about your sexual history. It is mind-blowing to me how many people do not do that with their spouse, where there are previous sexual traumas, and I'm not talking necessarily about like rape, right? I mean, a lot of times, most times in our experience with couples we've had a chance to mentor, most of the time the spouse knows about his or her partner's previous, they were raped previously, if that's sadly is a thing. But I'm talking about the more nuanced sexual traumas, right? Maybe there was sexual abuse in the family that did not involve that particular spouse, but did impact the way they think about sex. Yeah. Maybe they had a friend who was with someone who, sort of strong-armed them into, giving them blowjobs. And so your spouse just has a thing about oral sex that it really bothers them, and they've never spoken that because they go, well, I know I should, like, quote unquote, get over this, right? But I can't because it really impacted me, and they just don't say anything. And so that starts to erode the sexual intimacy in your marriage because there are roadblocks. And the problem is, for the spouse that doesn't know, it's like in our upstairs hallway is where we have the Lego table. Mm-hmm. And if you don't turn the hall light on and you venture to walk across that hallway, you're stepping on Legos. Yep. It's like that. You've not shared with your spouse these sharp, painful objects from your past. Oh, maybe you're stepping
on a tack?
Oh, man. Yeah, anyway. Maybe your kids left a tack out and it jammed way deep into your foot. So there are these hurtful, sharp objects that you have in the sexual arena of your life, and your spouse is going to start stepping on them. And when you react, without them understanding the genesis of that, they're just going to start to go, man, I need to walk on eggshells whenever I approach him or her sexually, best case. Worst case, they're going to start giving up, at least in certain areas of your sexual intimacy, and
But
put up barriers to
instead,
sexual
let's
intimacy.
turn the light on and
That's
start
exactly
cleaning
right.
up the Legos.
That's right. No, that's exactly right. And how does that start? Well, it starts by communicating. It starts by just sharing with your spouse, hey, there's some things I need to tell you about how I think about sex, and sharing it, and honoring your spouse enough to be honest with them and tell them. And honestly, for a lot of you, probably need to spend some time thinking about those things. Like, what are things that impact my sexual intimacy with my spouse, so that those can be shared.
Yep.
That's the first one. Second one is communication about your sexual relationship. Meaning, if your spouse is doing something you don't like, you gotta tell them, right? Please don't. And ladies, this I think can be a little bit more you than it is for us guys. You just want him to know. And I don't know if that's because in Hollywood, the guys always know the best sexual things to do.
Want, where he can read all your
That's right.
your thoughts.
That's
That'd
exactly
be
right.
Great though.
That would be terrifying. Remember when they're having sex and she starts going through her grocery list?
That's
that
true.
would be terrifying. Okay, so but the point that Andrea is saying is right. You have to talk to him, and you might be going, man, he's really bad at sex in this area or that area or the other area. But here's what I would say. He probably genuinely wants to please you, and he doesn't know that he's really bad in those, whatever those areas are. Right? Maybe it's how he leads up to sex. Maybe it's the things he's doing while you're having sex, right? He probably thinks he's got mad game. And you're going, nah, it's not doing it for me. And you're afraid to tell him because you don't want to hurt his feelings. But this is kind of like if your husband had a big hunk of food in between their front two teeth and you just didn't tell him for a week because you didn't want to hurt their feelings. When they find out, they're going to be really frustrated, right? Because why would you not tell me?
And the other side of this is communicate about the things that you do like or that
That's
you
exactly
do want.
right.
You know, what's more, what gets you jazzed up more about your sexual relationship than like, wow, you did that and it was great. And I loved that, you know. So talk about the things that you do like or the things that you do want. And and that alone, you know, having those conversations, although they may be awkward at first if that's not something that you're used to, embrace the awkward.
Yep.
It is worth it to have these conversations of talking about, I really think I would like this and let's try this sometime. And just having those conversations, I mean, that alone can really breed some intimacy in your sexual relationship and some excitement for things to new roads to pave and things to try.
Right. So a couple pro tips on that. There are two times.
I would not call us pros, but
there are two times. Yes, that's right. There are two times that are really good for having these types of conversations. Not immediately, but in the lead up to having sex and in the immediate afterglow of sex. So if it is something where you go, man, I really love when he does this, or particularly for a woman, I would really love if he would do this, tell him in the lead up. Like once you both are on the same page that you're going to be having sex shortly, then tell him, like, man, it'd be really great if you did this or this, and then this, right?
Yeah.
Guys, we all want to act like we got all this like mad game going on, but if we can sex by numbers, that's really helpful too. So, and we're already jazzed up, and we'll probably take just about any constructive advice you can give us at that point. The immediately after is a good time for, hey, and maybe it wasn't even something he just did. In fact, it might be better if it's not. Maybe it's something he did a week ago or whatever, where you're like, yeah, that didn't really do it for me. Or to just ask the question, and guys lead in this, to just go, hey, what do you not like when I do sexually? Or what do you wish I would do more often sexually? That sort of afterglow of sex is kind of a magic time. And, man, use that time to your advantage.
Yep.
So communicate about your past sexual trauma and those things that shaped your views on sex. Talk about your own sexual relationship with your spouse. And then the third one, and this one can be the trickiest, have a community that you can talk to about your sexual relationship.
Ooh, that is a tricky one.
And I'm not talking about like
Guess
your
what we did
buddies that
last
you're
night.
like, hey, let me give you the blow by blow. See what I did there?
Yeah. Oh my
But
gosh.
I'm talking.
No, that's not allowed.
Right. I'm talking about people that are comfortable looking you in the eye, and any couple that's ever sat on our couch that wanted constructive marriage mentoring I've warned them that they're going to have to answer this question: how's your sex life? Or more to the point of this episode, how's your sexual intimacy? Are you pursuing it? Is it getting deeper? Are you having sex? How is the sex that you're having? If you don't have a couple in your life that you can have super frank conversations with about sex,
Find one.
Because it's really important. For one thing, sex can be a difficult area for a lot of marriages. And so some accountability in that is really helpful. But also just feeling like you're not alone in that. Now, to be clear, you should be just you and your spouse alone when you're actually having sex. But in the conversations with your community, it's good to have people that you can talk to, and not necessarily maybe even co-ed times, but like it's good for Andrea to have her godly women in her life that she can talk to about this area of her life.
Yep.
And
about like, man, I'm just really struggling to even want that in this period, and we're struggling with our intimacy, and just having those conversations,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And man, we're pretty good. Most of us Christians are pretty good about having community about the other three legs of the intimacy table. But this one, we're like, okay, she can't be kissing and telling. Hogwash, right? Find some people that you can be honest with.
People who are
sexually.
Champions for godly marriage.
That's exactly right.
Who aren't trying to, get the scoop on your sex life.
Right.
So this is not a, let me tell you the details. But
no, it's about intimacy.
Right. Yep. Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's great.
So the other thing was intentionality. And to have an intimate sexual relationship, we have to be intentional. And of course that looks like intentionally making the choice and the time to have sex, but I'm not just talking about having sex. I mean, choosing to invest in the intimacy of your sexual relationship. So that means like, I can't be having quickies all the time just to check it off my list and be like, yep, we have sex. We've got a good sexual relationship. That's not an intimate relationship. And so we have to be intentional to think about what is this part of our relationship looking like lately? Are we really investing the time and the energy, even in seasons of our life where it feels like I don't have time or energy? Then you probably have too much on your plate. And we've got 5 kids, and there are people listening who probably have more kids than us, but that's a lot on your plate to have a lot of young kids.
Right.
But if you're choosing to make your marriage a priority, which I hope you are, then you'll choose to say, somehow we need to rearrange our lives so that we have the time and the energy to put into the intimacy of our relationship.
Right.
And that's not just sexually, although that is, of course, a piece of it, but you need to have the time and the energy to connect with each other emotionally and spiritually and all that kind of thing. And I get it. Life can be busy and
sure,
there can be so many things going on, but this is priority.
Yeah.
And so for us, we really try hard to make our intimacy in our sexual relationship a priority. And it takes work and it takes thought. It takes being intentional. It takes, hey, I have to be thinking about this and thinking about reserving some energy, or thinking about even just having it on my mind, because if I'm leaving our sexual relationship and hoping that to be intimate, if I'm leaving that to the last thought of the day, we're climbing in bed, I'm like, oh yeah, it really becomes a checklist item.
Yeah,
And that's
a good
not
call.
intimacy. It's just not intimacy. So making the choice to make it a priority, and then making a choice to carry through with that. So that's a big one. And then the other thing I was going to say is, within your sexual relationship, being intentional to pursue deeper levels of intimacy. So this may be like hey, our sexual relationship has always looked like this. Like it's pretty predictable.
Right.
I would say try to get out of that. If it's predictable,
it's a good call.
There's so much more for you that can really blast open the doors of sexual intimacy. And it's a really beautiful thing. So Nathan and I have been married for almost 18 years. It'll be 18 years in December. And we are still discovering things about each other. Maybe those things have changed because we change, kids change you, that sort of thing.
Yep.
But we're still discovering things about each other sexually. We're still realizing deeper levels of intimacy in our sexual relationship. Like
right.
it's new. Not like every time, but I don't feel like, oh my gosh, we've been married for almost 18 years and this sexual relationship has been the same boring, monotonous thing for 18 years. We've reached new levels of understanding each other and pursuing each other and things that we're interested in. And then we realize, and other things that were like, no, so,
right.
so
That's
it's an evolving relationship because we choose to make the intimacy side of it important. And so the evolution of our sexual intimacy is a really fun thing. And we look forward to the next however many years we have to continue to allow the Lord to evolve that. And that takes intentionality. It takes saying, we're going to get away so that we can spend time on all parts of intimacy together.
Yep, that's right.
We choose to take, time when we're not away, take time out of our normal everyday lives to sow into the intimacy of our marriage. And it takes so much intentionality. It doesn't just happen. Good things in life rarely just happen.
That's right.
They're choices. They're small choices, sometimes big choices, but oftentimes they're the small choices that I make to prioritize the right things.
That's right. So I hope as you walk away from this video, you feel like you're equipped with some choices that you can sit down and make with your spouse to dig into deeper levels of all intimacy, all four of those areas of intimacy, but specifically sexual intimacy in your relationship. So I hope that you commit to that. If there are things that you and your spouse have done or realized, hey, this really helps us grow in sexual intimacy together, love to have you put those in the comments below. Or if you're listening to us on podcast format, pop over to Facebook and check out Marriage by Design podcast page there. And I'd love to have you leave a comment there as well. So appreciate you guys joining us. Hope you have an exceptional week. We will see you next Monday for another edition of Marriage Monday. Until then, remember, God is for your marriage.